What's up, guys and gals? It's Shawn, Myszka, Movement Mastery, and OptimizeMovement.com coming to you with another movement lesson. In today's movement lesson, I want to chat with you about a topic that I feel is a pretty all-important one, and one that I also find is overlooked across this sport movement profession. It is one that we've discussed here before pretty extensively, not only in our content on dynamical systems theory and ecological psychology, but also when we have explored and conversed about structuring practice conditions which specifically address contextual aspects of open sport movement problems. This topic is none other than the information-movement coupling cycle, also known as perception-action coupling. These concepts basically state some central ideas oriented around the fact that when an athlete moves within the environment, information is generated and gathered, which leads to further movement actions. Essentially, these ideas will show or tell us that there's a constant cyclical relationship between information and movement, or the perception of our task in our environment and the corresponding movement actions that we will employ. When we look at the information generated then within ecological psychology, this would propose that the processes involved with the perception of information and the action of movement should never be studied separately, and instead we must understand that there's always interdependency between these two things. Furthermore then, this has implication to all of us as sport movement professionals who look to design more optimal practice structures which can help our athletes master their movements for sports as we look to understand the relationships between perception and action, or information and movement. For having one without the other being addressed in our training processes, our path towards movement mastery will always be limited and always be flawed. Taking this another step further then, when looking at some of the information that I've shared over the last couple of years here at Movement Mastery, you can see the correspondence between this perception-action coupling idea and that of the kinesiological pattern of sport movement that I've talked about here often, as well as the adjustment of the constraints of the environment and the task to elicit the evolution of the biodynamic structure of the movement. And additionally speaking, when we start to look at the analysis of the processes involved in each area of the human movement system as it attempts to solve familiar movement problems over time, namely the connections between the brain, the behaviors, and then the biomechanics. You know, we see plenty of sport movement professionals who hammer home principles of biomechanics with their athletes, looking for almost near perfection of the biomechanics and the kinematics during exercises, activities, and drills that are typically more closed in their environmental nature. Yet, then we wonder as professionals or coaches why the athlete cannot apply those same biomechanics, or even anything remotely close to those biomechanical displays, in the context of the sport movement environment that is usually of more open, chaotic nature. Well, in my mind, it all kind of stems from this perception-action coupling, or the lack thereof in most people's programming. We as human beings can't determine and or organize the proper movement actions respective of a sport movement problem without initial perception and adequate information about the problem first. Meaning, when coordinating movements with respect to the environment, the athlete needs to have very precise information about both the timing and the location of objects or particular obstacles or apparatuses within the task in the environment in order to navigate themselves within the problem or within respect to the problem and truly attempt to properly solve it with the most effective technical execution, also known as the most optimal or efficient biomechanics. You know, when an athlete moves, there is essentially a constant flow of information coming from this interaction of those three main constraints that exist within most movement problems: the task, the environment, and of course the organism or the athlete themselves. Essentially then, from this relationship, in the athlete's perception of this relationship, the human or the athlete starts to understand their given affordances for action based on what the movement problem gives them. Basically, what I'm saying here is that the information and energy from this sort of triphasic interaction constrains the control and coordination of the emergent movement pattern that the athlete will be able to employ to adequately overcome the problem specific to that situation. Sure, the resultant biomechanics is really what we see as movement professionals. And it's what the masterful mover is really calibrating and adjusting with respect to the situation. But it's through the improvement of the processes of the brain and the behaviors that this usually occurs. And here I'm talking about the identification of stimuli within the environment, and then the selection of appropriate responses in order to overcome the problems presented by that stimuli. And to do this then, the masterful athlete will utilize more finely tuned cognition and decision making, as well as gradually become more proficient at acquiring the different types of information through sources of the sensory system: visual, auditory, haptic or touch, or then proprioceptive. In these sensory things then, these aspects of the sensory system are all part of that information or perception portion that we're talking about here today in regards to information movement coupling. So I'm not saying to you guys that it's not advantageous for us to address aspects of the biomechanics and further the calibration of more efficient biomechanics, and quite the contrary actually. However, we may have to go about addressing it in some different ways in order to ensure that those biomechanics see themselves back into the context of the typical sport movement problem by linking them with the perceptual aspects of the movement problem. Unfortunately, most in our field seem to dilute this information movement coupling, and therefore this is why I feel that the biomechanics that they work so hard to develop never really end up showing themselves comes crunch time. So then, as movement professionals, how do we go about doing this to ensure that we overcome this problem that we have as a profession? Well, simply put, we need to ensure that the athlete will acquire the movement skills that will be applicable to the sport environment context. Therefore, they must learn the given typical invariants of the environment. When I say invariants, I mean the things that won't or don't change. And be able to have a comparison or a representation of a comparison of those to the variant. So the variants are then the things that do change. So the invariants versus the variants. And this comparison then will allow the athlete to essentially experiment with the typical problems that present themselves within the sport context. And the athlete then, as they move up or they acquire greater movement skill, will learn and attain how to overcome those informational constraints, which will allow for the employment of different movement strategies in the emergence of movement patterns that are more sufficient solutions. And the athlete then essentially does this by being exposed to situations or experiences that will require involvement in further development of those 3 B's of the human movement system, and that ongoing fine-tuning evolution of this relationship between each of these 3 characteristics and factors. Again, the brain, the behaviors, and the biomechanics. What I mean here is that the practice structure, as well as our instruction and our feedback, must allow the athlete's frame of reference for the movement solution within the changes in the environment to continually be developed. This type of focus then will take place through helping that athlete to pick up on the precise information from the situational context through that process in attainment of movement skill acquisition. It's through this then that biodynamic structure of the movement will become more solidified, yet get more flexible and adaptable to the ever-changing environment of the sport. And thus then, the athlete can execute with close to those desired biomechanics that were developed in the closed environment. So, some guidelines for you as movement professionals then to this is this. Nearly every practice session in my mind should in some way, for some portion or percentage of the session, attempt to challenge each of those 3 B's of human movement: the brain, the behaviors, and the biomechanics. The session should involve improving upon the athlete's ability to increase efficiency in the sensory and cognitive processing, so they get better at planning movement and selecting from given movement strategies, along with the improvement in the technical execution and biomechanical efficiency in the commonly rehearsed or having to be performed movement actions. Additionally, both the structure of the practice as well as our communication with the athlete should help elicit improved error detection and correction of the movement in regards to, again, both the biomechanics as well as the strategy selections being made by the athlete. So I'm talking here in regards to the application, we could use both random or varied practice along with so many of us who just stick with block practice. So we should involve all types of styles of practice structure. We should involve all styles of cueing as well as varying feedback schedules. We should utilize both part and whole motor learning applications. And finally, we should make sure that we're utilizing open and chaotic movement environments rather than just closed or pre-planned ones. All in all then, you can see this is a very loaded topic, but one that's extraordinarily important for all of us as sport movement professionals to attempt to fully understand. And therefore, I would implore you to always look for ways to maintain, understand, and solidify this information movement or perception action coupling in as much of your practice structure, your instruction, and your feedback as possible. So for another movement lesson, this has been Shawn Myszka, Movement Mastery, and OptimizeMovement.com. I'll talk to you guys on the flip side, and until then, let's continue to master the art of optimizing movement.